Shah Rukh Khan, the man, the myth, the legend, a star who has yet to lose his shine. Whether he's playing India's favorite patriot or vigilante, Shah Rukh Khan has become an icon and symbol for India's progress and unity. Symbol that's more of an ideal than a reality. Hello everyone and welcome back to Always Watching. Today we're discussing Shah Rukh Khan's most controversial and I think one of his most important films, Dil Se. Briefly, the film follows Amar, a young man who falls in love with a mysterious woman. Directed by Mani Ratnam, Dil Se is part of a trilogy which investigates love in a time of mayhem. The movie begins on a cold, rainy night. We are introduced to Amar, an upbeat and charming radio anchor from Delhi, whose life changes when he lays eyes on Meghna, a young woman part of a resistance faction fighting for independence. It's never made clear where Meghna is from. In an interview, Ratnam explained that this is because there were several troubled border states and they were looking for a story that could represent all of them. They did not want this to be a movie about one particular region. The film has been acclaimed for being a rare example of political allegory in Indian cinema. It weaves in this political narrative through the ancient Arabic idea of love, which follows 7 stages: attraction, infatuation, love, trust, worship, madness, and death. Amar has been said to represent the Indian government's obsession over disputed territories like Ladakh and Kashmir. And this film essentially investigates how this obsession will ultimately lead to everyone's demise. From the very beginning, when Amar lays eyes on Meghna, he views her as this rare object, this piece of jewelry he could wear and show off to everyone. Unlike Meghna, he grew up in a life of privilege. He grew up in Delhi, and he has this Bollywood idea of love and what it means to fall in love. The movie does start off as a typical Bollywood romance, a journalist falling in love with a freedom fighter. However, as the movie goes on, we see that his love is as far from romantic as possible. Meghna, unlike Amar, grew up in a life of instability and violence. She was brutally assaulted as a young child. Never really had the opportunity to dream of a life of happiness and peace like Amar has. One of the things that makes this movie very special is Amar's growth. When Amar first meets Meghna, he is totally ignorant to the world around him, and he contextualizes everything from his experiences and his worldview. He works for a government radio station, so he's essentially a mouthpiece for the central government in India. In the beginning, you can tell that he's not a very good journalist. He does absolutely no research, and he just regurgitates what he's been told his whole life. Of course, this changes as the movie goes on, and this point is really emphasized in one of his earlier interviews in the film. I actually think this is like one of the highlights of this entire movie. He is interviewing this man, part of a resistance faction in India, and this man is trying his best to explain to Amar the hypocrisy of the Indian government, that places like Delhi do not represent the entire country, and there are areas in India that are desperately fighting for recognition and respect. The conversation takes place in Hindi because Amar does not speak the language, a barrier he only deepens by reciting government talking points. He starts to berate the man about his involvement with China and Pakistan, and he asks all kinds of questions, and he's a really great example of how ignorance is bliss. And his questions were obviously a way to appease his audience. He was not really looking for answers, and anyone listening would be pretty satisfied with what they heard because his radio station appeals to those that really don't have space in their hearts to try and walk in someone else's shoes. I thought the decision to make him a radio anchor was really smart because Amar has never had trouble being listened to or heard his entire life. As the movie goes on, his interviews change. Like, we get snippets and he really starts to ask questions and push back against the government narrative. He never receives any answers, but he starts to scratch the surface. And just because he's ready to ask questions doesn't mean he's necessarily prepared for the answers that he's about to get. Now, right from the beginning, Amar's behavior towards Meghna is really troubling. And to make matters worse, he justifies his toxic behavior by blaming her. And the only time we see any self-control from Amar and some shame is when she lies to him and tells him that she's married. And I thought it was very interesting that this is what it took to deter him. And of course, it had less to do with her and more to do with his own reputation. By the time he figures out she's lying, he's both happy and distressed and spends the rest of the film desperately trying to reconnect with her and be with her. The second half of the movie takes place in Ladakh. And this is a side note, but I've actually been there. This t-shirt is from there. And it is a beautiful place that is totally inhospitable. We spent most of our time trying to breathe up there. I'm not really sure how they were able to dance and choreograph all these scenes in Ladakh. And I imagine it must have been a struggle, because I'm not even kidding. Like, it's a beautiful place, but if you stay for too long, honestly, unless you're from there, unless you're indigenous to the place, you really have no business living there or trying to build a life there. Besides Delhi, most of the film takes place in disputed territories that have had a long history of military interventions. And I was fortunate enough to travel through India briefly. And a lot of these places you're seeing in this film, culturally, religiously, ethnically, they feel like totally different countries. And their way of life and their way of doing things is currently being disrupted by the central government there. In 2019, Ladakh lost special controls over its land following a controversial move by the Indian central government that stripped the former state of Jammu and Kashmir of its statehood and broke off Ladakh, which had been a part of it, into a separate territory. Now, what does that mean? Practically speaking, it means since they are explicitly controlled by the central government, their laws, even their flag is now subject to erasure and change. Their populations are also under threat because anyone from India can now live in these regions that were previously designated to locals. Make matters worse, a lot of environmental protections can be stripped away in order to allow for infrastructure development. Now, all these conflicts between these countries, of course, overshadow the average person living in these places who are caught in the middle. I think the setting, specifically in Ladakh, was really beautiful because it's quite haunting. You have this untouched paradise. When you peer behind the curtain, you realize it masks a lot of pain and a lot of violence. I felt like the setting mirrored what Meghna was going through really well. Meghna has really suffered throughout her life. And now, to make matters worse, she is being harassed by a man who is completely obsessed with her. And while he's stalking her in Ladakh, he nearly assaults her. And his presence triggers her trauma, which of course does nothing to deter this man. And she is caught in a difficult situation because she can't fight him off and she can't tell him off. Like, she has to deal with him in some way because he just won't leave her alone. And Amar's behavior towards Meghna is really just troubling because he never tries to keep any space between them. He barges in on her constantly. He's hovering over her. He constantly oversteps any boundaries that she tries to set with him. Make matters worse, he makes it clear, like, I will never accept defeat. If he can't be with her, he will actively spend his life trying to be with her or near her in some way. And again, I think he definitely comes from privilege. He really believes, like, he has this fantasy idea of love. Like, of course I have to work hard for her. And this will be such a great story we tell our children. Like, he pursues her as if this is some sort of like movie. But it's not. So much of Meghna's hatred towards him stems from his like happiness and contentment. He enters every room as if it's his own, and you can tell this is not a young man who's ever been made to feel uncomfortable in any space in this country. I don't think she ever falls in love with him. I'm always disturbed by those interpretations. I think what she falls in love with or what she envies is his life. He has a wonderful family, a supportive family, and he lives this kind of ideal fantasy life that she can only dream of. When she disappears on him, he is devastated, and he spends the rest of the film desperately calling out to her through his radio show. During this pause, Amar meets and agrees to marry a young woman named Preeti, and this woman is really interesting because they are basically the same person. She also has this Bollywood idea of love, and she becomes kind of obsessed with him, but not so much with him, but this fairy tale life that she so desperately wants to live. And there is one scene where she walks in on Meghna training. She's not really able to clock that there's anything wrong with what they're doing, because Meghna lives in a world that she's never been exposed to and she knows nothing about, because why would she? And again, she's not a bad person. She's actually quite sweet throughout the film, but like Amar, she just doesn't have any awareness of the world outside of her. And you can see it in their behavior, the way she barges in, the way that she keeps absolutely no personal space between herself and Meghna. Like they are really the same person, and they are really a product of their environment. And even when she finds out about all this chaos that's happening with Amar, her only reaction is, what about the wedding invitations? Like, is this still happening? Like, that's her focus, like her world. Like, this does not concern her. This is not like a real threat that could ever affect her life. During their courtship, Meghna appears out of nowhere, or seemingly out of nowhere. And this is because Amar, in his desperate search for her, ends up nearly ruining her plans. His reaction when she returns to him is very interesting because his ego inflates, and he has the savior complex. He wants to be the one to swoop in and give her everything that she wants, but really it's like everything that he wants. Now, on a deep level, he knows that she's not really here for him. She knows that she's up to something. He started to educate himself about all these disputed regions, so we know that his awareness is growing. However, he's not really quick to figure out what she's up to because he doesn't want her to go away. In one of the most like unsettling scenes, he tries to reconnect with her. He can't control himself anymore, and he forces these headphones on her and makes her listen to their conversations, of course, that he's recorded without her permission. And because these conversations have no context, like he was stalking her and following her the entire time, he basically has been listening to these recordings and fantasizing about this relationship that they don't have. The way he put the headphones on her, like, girl, do you remember the good times? And I just kept thinking, no, like, these were not good times, weirdo. Like, you just followed her, but okay. Despite his ignorance, she knows that he cannot handle the level of violence that could potentially come his way. And I think the way they rub off on each other is really interesting, because sometimes when you're on one side of a conflict, you can really demonize the other side and paint a one-dimensional picture of what everyone on that side must be like. But the more they interact with each other, the more nuanced their perspective becomes. Amar is a very interesting character because he really is a product of his environment. Like, he's such a great example of that. Now, that doesn't justify his behavior, but he really just doesn't know that he's doing anything wrong. When the police start to hone in on Meghna and her group, their first stop is Amar's raggedy behind. And Amar is a patriot. The movie makes this very clear. He's the son of an army officer. His parents explicitly tell the police that if they even suspected that their son was a terrorist, they would throw him under the bus. They would be the first ones to escort him to the police station. And Amar's interactions with the police and also Meghna's group is the first time he's experienced real fear. This is the first time he really felt what it's like to be scared and run for his life and be chased. Like, this is not something that he's used to. He nearly dies, and there's a moment in the film where I actually thought he was shot, like he was done. And I think the deeper he gets into this, it's hard for him to truly hang on to that belief that they're going to be together. Like, he tries his best to hold on to this delusion, but the more he finds out about her and the more he finds out about what happens to people like her, he knows on some deep level that her cause is also worth dying for. When she finally tells him what she has gone through, what her life has been like, he's in shock. He was not ready for the answer, even though he asked the question. And his response was like, it's just a few bad apples. It's not that bad. But of course he knows that it is that bad. It's not a one-time thing. It's a thing. It's a daily occurrence that happens often. And although he doesn't fully appreciate the depths of it, just simply scratching the surface exposed him to this world that he really did not know existed. And the reason that he's so reluctant to accept her response and her point of view is because he's grown up with this belief that his government is good and they mean well for the most part, and he spent his life trying to paint his country in the best light possible. In doing so, he unknowingly buried and erased people like Meghna. The movie is very clever because once he finds out and he's not in denial about what Meghna plans to do, he immediately tries to inform the authorities. But because they think he's a suspect, they are no longer interested in listening to him. And this is the first time he's experienced that. He's so used to people hearing him out, and no one wants anything to do with him. And watching the military react to this potential plot was fascinating because they just did not want to take it seriously. And Meghna's group has really infiltrated. Like, they have made it to the point where they are able to intercept information that would allow them to change their plans. But for whatever reason, the military just does not want to give them any benefit of the doubt, because if they take this threat seriously, they have to acknowledge that the problem is a lot more severe than it actually is. And this is not something that they're willing to do. This movie is a product of its time because Amar makes it clear that she is up to no good. So he's done his part. Now, whether or not they listen, it almost doesn't matter. And one of the worries that the central government has is of conflicting loyalties, like people going back and forth or potentially defecting, and treason. Amar never commits treason. Like, he never betrays his country. And the movie makes that like crystal clear in the end credits that we really didn't need. I understand why they put it there. They didn't want to make the audience angry. And we will circle back to this point. Now, before this fatal finale, Amar tries desperately to plead with her, but he knows that it's over. Like, he's barely alive himself. And the type of love he's offering, this is not true love. This is not a Bollywood romance. His love is basically like, listen, you have to belong to someone anyways, so you might as well belong to me. If the movie had ended with their suicide, it would have been perfect, because we don't really know what's happening with the rest of the plan. Maybe they went through with it. It would have left us on a cliffhanger. But instead, they tell us exactly what happened. Very important to note that Meghna never reciprocates his love. She never says, I love you, even at her worst. Even just before she dies, she never ever like gives him that satisfaction. It makes clear that this is a woman whose cause is worth dying for. And maybe in committing suicide, some part of him knows that this is true. He loves her, but the way that he loves her is like of possession. Like, he never really sees her as a full human being. Like, he separates her trauma from who she is. At the time, this ending was really controversial, and producers initially wanted to cover up the bombing with the song Cha Cha Chaya. And I love this song, and their logic was, you know what, they can hear it twice. Like, it'll be amazing. And the director was like, absolutely not, we are not doing that. Indian cinema, particularly Bollywood, is about spectacle. It's about entertainment. It's about, you know, go big or go home. So people were not trying to come to the theaters and watch their hero die. Interesting fact, during this time, physical prints had to be sent to the theater. There is a chance that certain theaters made the edit, and there were people that got to hear the song twice. So if you are one of those people, you were only supposed to hear the song once. You saw the wrong version of the film. And apparently it was quite common for local theaters to re-edit movies if they didn't like it. Now, back to the ending. I've been really thinking about this. It's been troubling my soul. Like, why did they kill both of them? They could have just killed Meghna and left Amar alone. The police could have arrested Meghna and he could have just been the hero, especially considering the end credits. Instead, they are both completely obliterated. There's one scene earlier in the film where Amar is joking that the more you love someone, the harder you hit them, the more abusive you are. Like, they're basically walking through Ladakh, and he's joking that the reason that she's rejecting him and that she pushes him away is because she loves him. And that logic is super sinister, because it implies that the more you love someone, the harder you're willing to fight for it, even to the death. I think meeting Meghna definitely altered Amar's brain chemistry. it gave him a sense of awareness that he did not have before, and it's not really a sense of awareness that he really wanted. He did not kill her family, he did not brutally assault it, but the ideas that he has grown up with, the propaganda in his head did. And this analogy, of course, can be applied to any country with disputed territories, not just India. I think sometimes economic progress can actually hide or shield these very deep conflicts in these regions. A lot of countries, not just India, are trying to progress as fast as possible. And this creates an image of unity that's simply not true. I think there's a reason why they say history repeats itself, because a country that doesn't acknowledge its past, or worse, try to defend it, is bound to be obliterated. Now, in terms of Shah Rukh Khan, I think this is a very unique role in that the audience reaction to his death was so serious, and this movie eventually became a cult classic, but at the time it was a total failure because people were so offended, like, how dare you kill my hero? And I think it's such a great example of why you shouldn't pedestalize or idolize anyone, because you're bound to be disappointed. Anyways, you guys let me know what you think. Until next time.